You know, the FLUXUS artists and the poets, they could talk for hours. They were fascinating. So I got drawn into this world. And they were wonderful because they were inventive, you know. They were making things all the time and, you know, drinking together, eating together, very important. I went to art school in England, and when I arrived at the art school, it was called Bath Academy of Art, they gave us all tests for 2 weeks. We had to like draw things or make things, and then after 2 weeks they said, you're going to sculpture, you're going to go to painting, and I had to go to graphics. I had no choice. I wanted to be a painter actually, so I went to graphics, and then I discovered that they were teaching printmaking and photography. And I loved both of these things. So, you know, and I learned etching, I learned lithography, I learned silkscreen printing and photography, and also some graphic design. And we had, one of our teachers was Swiss. His name was Serge Stauffer, and he was a Marcel Duchamp specialist. So this was all kind of, you know, it was a great place to go. And I started, you know, making prints and doing them even at home. I set up my own darkroom at home, you know, and so, yeah. So I did some painting, but basically I was making prints then. And I knew how to do it myself. And I loved doing it myself. Yeah, and then I found out after that I could earn money teaching that, you know, because I went to America, and then, you know, people found out that I knew how to run an offset press, and I knew how to do silkscreen prints and work in the darkroom. So I got jobs, you know, and that was great. Hansjörg Mayer was my teacher at art school, and I was a hard-working student. And so he said, you know, he knew that when I was finishing art school, I was going to have this long summer ahead of me, and he said, if you would like to come to Germany, I'll give you a job at Hansjörg Mayer. Edizioni Hansjörg Mayer, it was called, in Stuttgart. His parents had a printing house there. It was metal type in those days. And we were able to work in the factory when the people went home at night and on the weekends when they weren't there. And Hansjörg printed all of his books there, and he set the type himself. And I was, you know, it was all locked up letterpress units, and I was looking up all of the pages for his catalogue, essentially, and helping to make photographs in the darkroom and things like that. So, well, they were sharing, Hansjörg Mayer and Dick Higgins were sharing a booth at the Frankfurt Buchmesse in the book fair, and I went with Hansjörg to the book fair and met Dick Higgins. And it just happened that I was, you know, looking for a job because, you know, my job with Hansjörg was going to end when he went back to teaching in the autumn. And this was already October, and Dick Higgins said, if you can come to New York immediately, I will give you a job as my assistant, because he thought that would be perfect, you know. And it took me a while. I won a scholarship. I got the money, but I had to get the visas and things like that. But I arrived in New York on Thanksgiving Day, the last Thursday in November, and began work at the Something Else Press. So. And, but it was a very different job with Dick Higgins, because actually he wanted me to be sitting at the desk and be answering the telephone and making phone calls instead of working in the darkroom or printing, which is what I wanted to do, you know. So, and so it wasn't so interesting. But the good thing about it was that at the other end of the room, there was the editor's office, and the editor at that time was a man called Emmett Williams. So, yes, and so that was very nice. So, you know, immediately I started, you know, talking with Emmett every day, and I think it took us about 2 months to get together, you know. But after Christmas, after he came back from visiting his parents at Christmas, he kind of asked me if I would like to maybe live with him, and I think I moved in with him in March, so it was November to March, you know. But yeah, and then we were together until he died, which was 2007. So we were there for 2 years, but what happened was that the California Institute of the Arts opened in Los Angeles. This is the Walt Disney School, and a lot of artists were invited to go there. It was going to be like you know, multiple, there was a theater school, there was a design school, a film school, all in the same building, so that everyone could kind of intermingle and do intermedia, you know. And so Namjoon Paik was invited there, and also Alison Knowles and Dick Higgins, and Emmett Williams was in the critical studies department. Alan Caprow was head of the art school. You know, so it was a really interesting place to go, and they had a big graphics workshop, so then they found out I could run the press and work in the darkroom, so I got a job there supervising the workshops. Yeah. I heard about FLUXUS when I was still at art school, but nobody approved of it then. You know, there were a couple of students in the sculpture department who were working with someone who had known Emmett Williams in France. And they made some strange objects for their final exams, and the people who came to judge, you know, our final exhibitions were not at all amused at this. You know, they didn't like it at all. So I'd heard about FLUXUS, but I hadn't come in contact with anybody then. And it wasn't until I went to work in New York with Dick Higgins that I started meeting all the FLUXUS artists, because he had been one of the founding members, he and his wife. Emmett was working there, and then everybody was coming to the Something Else press, because they had a gallery there, and you know, they were everybody wants to be published, right? You know, so I think the very first night I was there, Al Hansen came by for drinks. The Higginses had a lot of money, and they used to like pour glasses like this big, full of gin, you know, like, and people came at 6 o'clock to drink there, you know. And so Al Hansen was there, and Philip Corner was living in Alison Knowles' studio upstairs, and Emmett was, of course, there. And he brought Tom Wasmuth, who was teaching and had been in France with him as well. So, you know, it was a circle of people who all knew each other. And the first book I saw when I went there was Notations by John Cage. They'd just brought it out. And they'd already published Merce Cunningham's dance book, and they'd done Klaus Oldenburg's Store Days. And I mean, it was just an amazing, you know, place to be, with people coming through all the time. And, you know, and I love the genre of artist book, because, you know, this is what Hansjörg Mayer was publishing. He was doing books with Dieter Roth and with Robert Filiou and with Emmett Williams. And, you know, so he was, doing artist books, and he kind of co-published. He did the European edition, and Dick Higgins brought out the American edition of the same book with different covers, you know. So there was also Daniel Spoerri's Anecdoted Topography of Chance, and Robert Filiou's little books. And so I was familiar with those, and I loved them. And I wanted to work with artists on books. Well, of course, again, you know, when I was at art school, one of my teachers was John Furnivall, who was a visual poet and living in the west of England. And he came to Bath, where I was a student 2 days a week. And he wanted us to work with concrete poets to make prints for them. And so he put us in touch with all of the poets that he knew all over the world. And they sent him what they called one-line poems, essentially. And as students, we had to choose one of these one-line poems and turn it into a visual work of art. And I chose Ian Hamilton Finlay as my correspondent, and I made a series of prints with him. And we never met each other, but we wrote letters to each other. And all of these letters are now at the Getty Research Institute. But I found that fascinating, to be working with a poet, you know, and making works with him and making prints. Yes, yes, and of course I love to read, and I was brought up reading a lot of books, and I wasn't brought up. I did read a lot of books growing up, and I loved English classics. But then, you know, one of the books I discovered was Sweethearts by Emmett Williams. When I was already, you know, Hansjörg Mayer published that. First of all, and then it was republished by Dick Higgins. But the Hansjörg Mayer one I owned, and then there was another book called Footnotes to Sweethearts, which was back-to-back with a book of Dieter Roth's. And I read these poems of Emmett's, and they were so witty and full of humor, and they were such fun, you know. And then, of course, through the Anthology of Concrete Poetry, which Emmett published in 1967, I got to know the work of these other visual poets, and then I began meeting some of them, because they would come to New York, or they would visit Hansjörg Mayer, or, you know, and they were all fascinating people. They were all the FLUXUS artists and the poets, they could talk for hours. They were fascinating. So I got drawn into this world. And they were wonderful because they were inventive, they were making things all the time and, drinking together, eating together, very important. Well, it was great working with Emmett because he was, he had wonderful ideas and could tell wonderful stories, but he didn't actually do any of the kind of physical, making negatives or developing things. I mean, he could use the typewriter fine. He never learned how to use the computer, So he did a lot of writing, and he had worked as a proofreader. So I would be typing the texts, and he would proofread them, and then I'd make all the corrections, But he was excellent at this. He was an excellent editor. That was his job. He worked for a newspaper for years doing features. And there is a book by Dick Higgins which started out, it's made like a Bible. It was about this big. And Emmett took it and edited down until it ended up about this big. And this is the book which starts FOEW, which actually is for Oscar Emmett Williams. People don't know that, but it's because Emmett helped him so much. The first diary was given to me, the 5-year diary was given to me in 1963, and I wrote in it sporadically. I didn't do all 5 years, but there are some years I wrote more than others. But essentially, I saw Dieter Roth's diary from 1967. Hansjörg Mayer was going to publish it, and it was full of the most beautiful little drawings and poems and notations. And I thought I should keep a diary, because my last year at art school was 1967-68. And so for the 1968, I bought myself a little one, a little like this size, and I wrote in it every day about what I was doing, at Bath Academy my last year. And then after leaving art school, I went to Germany to work for Hansjörg Mayer. So then I was meeting all of these wonderful authors. We made an exhibition with with Robert Filiu, at the end of 68, in September. And I was working with Robert to put the exhibition together, so this was fascinating for me. And the next year, I went to New York, so I bought an American day-to-day diary in New York and was recording everyone I was meeting there, Dorothy Iannone and Dieter Roth, who came to stay at the Chelsea Hotel, which was a very famous place in those days. And all kinds of people. The list is, I met hundreds of people in New York. And I felt, I've got to record this is important, And from New York, we went, first of all to the University of Kentucky, where Emmett was artist-in-residence, and then from there to California, to Cal Arts. And again, fascinating people at this school, Ravi Shankar was teaching there, imagine that. And, so, I just got into the habit of recording every day what was happening, whatever I went to. Was it a performance, a concert? Was it music? Was it an art show, Or having dinner with somebody? And, so it became that habit. After that, we went to Nova Scotia, where there was a very good art school, again, where the president was inviting artists who were on their way to New York to stop over in Canada on the way down to New York and give a class in a class he called Art Now. So all of these people came through this school so I recorded every Art Now class, It's like a sketchbook in writing, And I can also follow when I had the first idea to make a certain work and how it developed over time. And I love this. I love the idea that you start with an idea and by the next day it's changed a bit because, you started making something, and then I write down the next step that or I just decided, or I've changed my mind, so I like following the process of making something. Well, I'm left-handed, first of all, so they tried to teach me how to make nice handwriting at school, but because I was left-handed, I couldn't write the way other people did, My brother Hugh was also left-handed, but he turned his hand around like that to write, and I write like this. But also, I have a photographic sense. I mean, pages, nice pages I can remember because they're beautifully laid out. So I started like writing very carefully and making each page beautiful so I could remember things more easily. So my writing became almost like printing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, but then also how the page was arranged, you know, how I wrote things, and because it was very important for me to be able to remember geography or history by the way the page was written. And then I loved, of course, illustrating. I loved to draw maps and make sketches, and yeah. I mean, I didn't realize it until later, because of course, I mean, I liked the idea of drawing and painting but then I realized that these people could only end up teaching in some art school somewhere, and they teach people to paint just like them. And so for me, it was great to be learning these skills that I could then, use as part of my own work. Well, because I'm a very methodical person and I save everything, and so was Emmett. Emmett knew, he loved artist books. Of course, he was making them all of his life, and he was a poet, so he was collecting works by poets. I mean, he was the one who introduced Francesco Conz to many poets. And he'd been living in Paris. He knew Bernard Heidsieck. He knew Peggy Guggenheim. I mean, he actually had an affair with one of her, nieces, but we don't go into that because he was still married at the time. But he knew all of the people then, and so he kept papers too. And so when we moved everything to Berlin in '84, I think we brought everything from America to Berlin, I started organizing the archive in our flat. And so we had one bookcase only for the letters, the correspondence. And then Emmett put all the files, he put all the Dieter wrote letters in one file, all the Alison letter in another, And then he took catalogues which were rare or there were only a few copies of, and put them inside envelopes to protect them, and put them in a steel filing cabinet alphabetically so that he could, So he had a really good sense of how to order his work. And so when he died, I carried on. I thought, So first of all, I reorganized the whole library and put everything in alphabetical order, and I scanned the covers of all of the books and I listed them. And because I had the idea then that I wasn't going to keep this archive, it was going to go somewhere, and I should, And for my own work, I also, as soon as I got a computer, which was 1991, I started making files of my work. And I put it into like ring binders, year by year by year, and with photographs of the works. And so I had 3 volumes of this, works already with texts and sizes and dates. And the designer of this catalog here, Santiago da Silva, came and looked at these at my place, and he said, "Oh, we have to make a catalog. Let's apply for the money to make a catalog raisonné, And so he took the ring binders with him to show to Jenny Chert at the gallery, Chet Ludder, and she and he sat together and wrote out the application for the Stiftung Kunstfonds in Bonn. And we were all a bit surprised when we actually got the money, but it was great. But so essentially I had done all of that groundwork before. And I had also files full of all the photographs of my work that had been taken up to that point. Some of them weren't very good, but then we got the money to hire a photographer to make better photographs, But essentially he just took my catalogues and made the book out of them. And then the chronology in the back of the catalogue comes from my careful lists as well. I had everything in the computer so that it was quite easy to organize year by year by year. And his contribution was to develop the typeface from my handwriting, and also to choose 3 other typefaces for things that were written by other people, for information about the works, the size, the date, whatever. And the other one is like reviews and things that other people wrote about my exhibitions, so. But that was his idea because, but I think that we both, he liked the way I was writing and working because he's a graphic designer. So we hit it off immediately. I love it. I really love it, and I even now, when I'm making a work, I think like a printmaker. You know, I think about layering colors one over the other, and I think about transparent colors and the third color created, and you know, working like for the cover here, which is 3 colors, and then you make as many colors out of 3 colors as you can, and this fascinates me. You know, it's for the works that I put inside the book boxes last night, I used transparent ink. So again, when you put one color over another, it makes another color. You know, and they blend into each other. And I buy pigment inks so that you get the best possible color, and you know, yeah. And I love paper, and I love, you know, I make boxes. I love FLUXUS boxes. I'm making boxes and tins and objects all the time, so, yeah. Well, you know, I was brought up in a very conservative kind of art school. It was progressive at the time because they invited so many visiting artists to come there. But essentially, they were teaching the basics. And I think I became more playful as I learned, as I got to know FLUXUS artists, and I also started branching out a bit more, like, you know, like doing a lot more mail art. Mail art was a big thing in the 70s, and I met poets who were sending their work by mail to each other, so I started printing postcards and things like that could go through the mail. And so I became less serious kind of artist, you know. I mean, I wasn't there with a huge canvas in a studio, you know, because I needed to carry my work with me. I had to have work that I could roll up and take to Poland to make an exhibition, you know. So I think that was a big change in my life, not to be so serious, a serious artist, you know, but to have fun.
There is a bit of FLUXUS in this.
Yes, yes. And also, you know, I didn't really want to be a performer, but I became one because, you know, my husband, he was a poet, and, you know, his contribution was to perform words as a performer on a stage, and of course he had great stage presence, Emmett. And then later, as he got older, he wanted me to travel with him and to also go on stage with him. So I kind of joined him in performance events after we came to Berlin. I think the first series performance was '84 together. And then after that, we did it more and more because I was quite good on stage. And then there came these FLUXUS festivals. I think the first one I took part in was in '85 in Roskilde, Denmark, which Erik Andersen organized. And after that, I was also invited to the FLUXUS festivals to be an extra performer because, you know, there were many pieces where they needed 5 or 6 performers to do the piece properly and didn't want it to be all men, you know, like. So,
yeah, you have that particular spirale.
Yeah.
Can you talk about a bit?
Well, that came about because we had a friend in Berlin who was a performer. He did, his name was Eberhard Blum, and he organized a series of concerts of new music at the Akademie der Künste, and he invited Emmett to take part, and then Emmett said, no, I'll take part with Ann, you know, so. And then, you know, he'd made this big cloth with Francesco Conz with the alphabet square, where there's an A in the middle and it spirals out until there's an A in each corner of the cloth. And we used that as a performance score. There are 28 alphabets altogether on this cloth, and so we devised 28 alphabets to perform. Sometimes it was just one of us on stage, sometimes for singing, there were 2 of us on stage, and there were all kinds of categories. So it was popular songs, names of artists, kinds of movements, everything we could think of, you know, onomatopoeia, you know, just sounds. And so we both kind of wrote these lists, and we didn't want to read on stage, so we had to memorize. And so we went on stage and we'd say, okay, next category, and it would come up, and then we'd start A, and so I would have to think of something with A, and then he would have to think of something with A, and so on. And so it was like a memory test and a playfulness going on at the same time, you know? And singing songs was great because Emmett had been trained by his mother at a very early age to perform at parties. And he knew a great many strange songs from years ago, you know, like Popeye the Sailor Man and things like that, you know. So he'd be singing these strange songs from his youth, and I would be coming up with like Beatles songs or things that I knew, you know. So, but it was again fun. We played on stage, and So we did it first at the Academie der Künste, and then we did it again in Roskilde in Denmark. And then our son, who was then 12, joined us on stage and was performing with us. And so he became a performer too, you know. He still is performing. He's now an actor, singer, songwriter. Well, no, we were living in Vermont at the time. After Halifax, Nova Scotia, we lived for a brief time very close to Dick Higgins in Vermont. And Francesco was visiting America, and he came up to Vermont with Charlotte Moorman. And they came and knocked on our door because we didn't have a telephone. And so, yes, they visited us in our log cabin. We were living in a log cabin, log house. And Charlotte knew Emmett because he'd taken part in some of the avant-garde festivals in New York. And yeah, so that was our first meeting. That was, I think it was 74. And then when we moved to Berlin in 1980, one of the first things that happened was that Francesco Conz came to visit us here and invited Emmett to go to Verona to make works. He was then in Verona already. But in '82, Emmett also had a retrospective exhibition at the National Gallery here, and Francesco Conz came for that. And of course, every FLUXUS festival he came to, you know, so we saw a lot of him. Yeah. Yes, this came about because he knew I was writing a diary, and he was taking the photographs, but he just was throwing them in boxes. He couldn't really organize anything, and he didn't know what he was photographing half the time. So, you know, I was there and I was keeping records, especially during the festivals, you know, who was performing on which day, and I'd made programs, and so I could organize his photographs and also write from my diary who was performing when. And so first of all, he gave me a huge photograph album bound in white leather and asked me to make a one-of-a-kind, an original book using his photographs and my writings. And I finished the first volume, and he liked it so much that he then bought me another book, this time with a brown leather cover, and asked me to make the second book. And for this, he gave me all of the photographs that he had taken in Seoul, Korea, for example, for the Seoul Festival. And so I made a second book, and they were just one-time books, you know, they were just a single original book. And then towards the end of his life, when he knew he was going to die in a few years, he started publishing lots of books. And he had the idea to send these photograph albums back to me in Berlin and have me compile them into one single book. And all the photographs. So I scanned the whole thing. I scanned both the photograph albums and made them smaller in the computer and made a book layout, you know, from the scans. So essentially, and then I made the original drawings smaller too, so that, you know, I'd made original drawings in these photograph albums. And so I made this book at home, and then I was invited to the Emily Harvey Foundation in Venedig, in Venice, for a month, and I worked with the printer there in Venice to, you know, prepare the plates for printing and be there. So yeah, that was 2008 when I went to Venice in January. Yeah.
Yeah. And Emmett also made a lot of editions together.
Yeah. So,
how was their collaboration?
well, I mean, the thing was that, you know, Emmett being a poet and a visual poet, he had lots and lots of typewritten things, and so sometimes they just took the typewritten thing and blew it up bigger. Sometimes Emmett hand wrote it onto canvas, and then it was printed from his handmade originals. But Emmett loved doing prints. I'd done a lot of prints myself with him. Starting in America, I was making prints with him a lot. And then Emmett could travel to Verona. He did that very happily, to go and work with Francesco in Verona. I stayed in Berlin because we had our son who was going to school here, and I had to be at home with Gary. So I didn't go so often with him, but, you know, later on when Gary got older, then it was easier to have him go stay with friends, and then I could travel more with Emmett.
And what do you think of Conz's commitment to collecting?
Well, you know, I mean, I think you know, the work is it's on very many levels. There were some people who were not very good visually at all. And, you know, but he made no distinction between so-called good artists or not so good artists or good poets or not so good poets. He printed everything. And in a way, that was very nice that he did that, but then there's an awful lot of stuff which I think is not so interesting, you know. And, but okay, I mean, I don't know whether he consciously knew which were the better poets and the better artists. He liked people, he liked to be with the artists, and he didn't, you know, if they were fun to be with, he wanted to be with them. Didn't matter about the quality of the work, you know, so. And then there were some people who didn't want to be with him at all, like Yaroslav Kozłowski. You know, he couldn't get Yaroslav to go and work with him because Yaroslav didn't like him. He drank too much, and Yaroslav was, you know, a Pole who did not drink vodka, you know, so. So, yeah, so that was very interesting too, the ones that got on with him and the ones that didn't, you know. And, but most of the time, people liked to get published, you know, so they didn't say no when he offered to make a print with them.
This was my last question, actually. If you would like to say something additional that we didn't touch, of course you're free. But
Oh, I like to be asked questions, you know, because it's easier,
also,
you know, yeah.
Yeah, these were all my questions.
Yeah, okay. No, I mean, I can just add that, you know, towards the end of his life, Francesco was really quite a dangerous person to be with because he, you know, he lost his driving license and he would still be driving a car when he wanted to go places, you know, and he'd been drinking, you know, and he would like many Italians, you know, go down on the fastest lane, overtaking all the other cars and honking his horn, you know, and you'd be sitting in the car like this, you know, like thinking it was going to be your last minute, you know, that, yeah, so, you know, you kind of, you know, you had to be very careful with him, yeah.
In general, I think he was a tough character.
Yeah.
Comes about producing works and so on, like.
And also, you know, he would have you sign your tablecloths when you went out to a restaurant, so, you know, you'd leave your handbag lying somewhere and all of a sudden it was gone into a bag, you know, and I mean, so you had to, you know.
What do you think about this?
Well, I thought that was a bit crazy, frankly, you know, but I mean, I don't want people's underwear, you know, but he liked, you know, I mean. I remember Michael Morris being there with us one, you know, and he took Michael Morris's underwear. I thought, what is this, you know, like, you know, yeah. And then he showed us Charlotte Mormon's nightdress, and I don't know, you know, and I thought, yeah, so, yeah. But I know that collectors, I mean, there's another collector, a FLUXUS collector, Hans Noël, who was a dentist in Stuttgart, and he was like this too, you know, that if he came to visit you, you had to put things away because otherwise they would disappear, you know, and one time Emmett was missing something and he said, I know where it is, and he went to the bag and he opened the bag and there it was, you know, like, you know, because, you know, collectors are a bit, you know, they go overboard, they want all of you, not just, you know, not just your work, you know,
Yeah,
so,
I
yeah.
think nowadays is also different with the art markets and all of that.
Yeah. And also I remember in Seoul, Korea, where Francesco was coming up onto the stage after performances and picking up all the things that were lying on the floor of the stage after the performance and putting them into envelopes, you know, so just the kind of, you know, whatever was left on the floor. And I mean, they're not exactly artworks, they were, you know, pieces that were used to make performances. So scraps of paper, matches, you name it, you know, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know. And also, after he died, I was invited to go there to this kind of memorial service that was held, and I made a big score. I actually sang songs for every letter of his name. And I had a big score that opened out with his name on one side and the songs on the other side. And after my performance, this disappeared. It just went. Someone had taken it. And so somewhere in Italy, someone has this original score of mine, you know. But it just disappeared into somebody's collection, right? You know? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it was very nice.
Okay.